thewellnesscouch.com, streaming wellness into your lives. Download the app today.
This is Up for a Chat with your hosts, Cindy O'Meara and Kim Morrison.
Here we are, up for a chat about the hottest topics that are important to you, inspiring you to awaken the change within. I'm Cindy O'Meara.
And I'm Kim Morrison. And boy, are we excited this week to have an incredible soul, the amazing Dr. Peter Bruckner. Can we welcome you, you amazing soul, to the Up for a Chat podcast. Thank you for being with us this week, right here, right now.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's always good to chat. Cindy and I have had a few chats over the years, and looking forward to another one. It'll be great.
Well, before you two start talking, can I just say I attended one of your lectures or a number of your lectures, and I'm pretty sure I saw you speak at Olympic Park in Melbourne in the late 80s. I was flabbergasted with your knowledge back then around sports science, and I think from memory, one of the talks was with Karen Inge. Does this all sound familiar to you, Peter?
Oh, it does, yes. In the dim, distant past, Kim, yes, I can remember all that stuff. That was in my previous life as a sports medicine clinician, So, they were great times. We started up a clinic in Melbourne here and had a great group of people, including Karen Inge, who was a dietitian, one of the first sports dietitians around, actually. And we had a great group of doctors and physios and massage therapists and podiatrists and so on. It was a fun time, and did some really interesting stuff there, interesting research, and a very good group. So fond memories of those days.
Before we go more into that, do you think you could just take us back a little bit as to how you became so fascinated with the human body and what got you into medicine, and how did that all begin for you? Oh, gosh.
Okay. Righto. Back at school. Well, I guess my first love has always been sport. I don't know why, my parents are quite normal, but I became quite obsessed with sport right from a childhood. And right through my childhood, I was either playing sport or reading about sport or watching sport and so on. I'd sort of be the sort of person who'd sort of turn straight to the back page, before the front page, of the newspaper. And in fact, I thought when I was a kid, no, I'll know when I've finally grown up when I start reading the front page first, but that hasn't happened yet. So, maybe it will one day. But sport was always my love. I played a lot of sport. I was not, great at anything. I was okay at a lot of sports and I got a lot of enjoyment out of it. But I sort of realised that, probably, when I was in my teenage years that I wasn't going to be able to make a living out of playing sport. I better come up with another plan. I actually would have liked to have been a sports commentator. That's what I really wanted to be. But my mother didn't think that was an appropriate career for her little Petey. And she convinced me to do medicine. And to be honest, look, the idea of doing medicine had always appealed. And I guess the attraction was that, you were being useful, you were being helpful, you were helping people, and that always appealed to me. And I really like the word useful. I've sort of become it's my new favourite word. And I think, certainly as a doctor, you can be useful to a lot of people and so on. So that's probably what got me into medicine in the first place. I wasn't a particularly good medical student, I have to say. My friends would vouch for that I scraped through. I was too busy playing sport and running sporting clubs and things like that. That's my other passion, is sort of running sports clubs. I've been involved with some amateur, sporting clubs for a long time, and I love that. And so I did that instead of studying through my medicine. But eventually I got through and got serious about medicine towards the end. And so then I went off to, I graduated, worked here for a couple of years, went off to England to practice on the Poms, and spent a lot of time watching sport. I went to, to football, a lot of football, a lot of soccer and cricket, and went to the 1980 Olympics and, lots of, stuff. So I'd work and go off and watch a bit of sport and work a bit. And so that was good fun. Came back, went into general practice because there wasn't any sports medicine around in those days. This is the early 80s we're talking about. And I'm dating myself, aren't I? The early 80s. And I started off in general practice down in southeastern Melbourne in a suburb called McKinnon. And because of my interest in sport, I got involved in sort of sports medicine just as it was starting. There was a little course that they ran for GPs, which I did. And then we set up a little sports medicine clinic as an adjunct to our general practice, and got a couple of physios in and started doing a bit of sports medicine and general practice at the same time. And then 1986, we got an opportunity to open a new sports medicine centre at Olympic Park in Melbourne, and it was right in the hub of where all the sort of sport was happening. And they decided they wanted to have a sports medicine clinic. We put a tender together, and we won the tender. And I decided I'd give it a go for 6 months, full-time sports medicine, because there really wasn't anyone doing full-time sports medicine in those days. And I thought I'd give that a crack, and I could always go back to general practice if I needed to. But that was what was that? 40 odd years ago, and I haven't got back to general practice since. So that started Olympic Park Sports Medicine Centre. Soon became, I think, the biggest clinic in the country, and we had up to 50 odd people working there: doctors, physios, massage therapists, podiatrists, and so on. That was great, and then I got involved with different sporting teams. I'd had a long involvement with the Melbourne University Football Club, and sort of indirectly through that, I got asked to go away with the Australian team to the World University Games. And the first one I went to was in Edmonton, Canada, and then Kobe, Japan, and then Zagreb, which in those days was Yugoslavia. So I went to 3 of those. They were my sort of first international trips, and that was fantastic. That gave me a foot in the door, and through that I met a whole bunch of other coaches and staff and so on. And then one thing led to another. I worked with the Australian swim team for a while, and then got a gig with the athletics team for about 10 years through the 1990s. Travelled to all the World Championships and Commonwealth Games and things like that. And then actually before that, I'd also got a job with one of the AFL teams with Melbourne, or VFL as it was in those days, Melbourne Football Club. I did that for a few years, and was also starting to present at conferences and travel to conferences and things. And then got asked to write a textbook, which was a bit weird. And someone had read an article I wrote and said, would you write a textbook? And I said, no, I'm not really experienced enough for that. And then my colleagues reminded me that I'd basically bagged the crap out of every other sports medicine textbook that had been written because they were all terrible. So we finished up writing a textbook, and that turned out to be a huge success. And we're now on the 6th edition of that textbook, Brukner and Kahn's Clinical Sports Medicine, and it's the Bible of sports medicine around the world, which we never really even dreamt of in those days. So that's worked out pretty well. And then kept running the clinic in Melbourne and working with teams. Did 2 Olympics. Did the Atlanta Olympics as the doctor for the athletics team and the assistant manager. And then they realised I wasn't much of a doctor, so they made me the manager for the athletics team in Sydney. That was a great experience, sort of all the planning for a couple of years leading up to that. And then the Sydney Olympics, I was in charge of the biggest team within a team. We had 82 athletes and 30-odd staff, and that was an amazing experience to be involved with that. And then I took a bit of a break from travelling because I was, kids were sort of growing up and teenagers, and then, we needed an extra pair of hands around the place. So, but then a few years later, I went back to working with teams, worked with the Socceroos. So for 4 years leading up to the World Cup in 2010 in South Africa. So did that. That was a great experience as well. We didn't do quite as well as we'd hoped, but the 3 or 4 years leading up to it was amazing. We travelled all around Asia, all sorts of different countries, playing qualifying games and so on, and then got there in the end. And then straight after that, I went off back to the UK and took up a job as the head of sports medicine and sports science at the Liverpool Football Club, a very famous club, which was actually going through some pretty rough times. It was a bit of a shambles when I got there, to be honest. But spent 3 years there. Had a great 3 years in Liverpool. Loved the city. Any city that's 2 passions are football and the Beatles can't be a bad city, I reckon. And I had a great time there. And then that finished up. And what happened then? Then out of the blue, I got offered to travel with the Australian cricket team. And cricket had been my sport as a kid, and but I just hadn't been involved with cricket up till then for various reasons. Someone else was doing cricket, and I was doing other sports and so on. And I sort of thought, oh well, I guess I'll never get to do cricket. My real love. And just out of the blue, they needed someone at short notice, and I went and did a tour, and they said, would you do some more tours? And I said, well, to be honest, it's really hard to fit in, because up till then they just had various doctors doing tours, and they grabbed someone for a month or two here and there. And I said, look, that's really difficult if you've got a full-time job. Why don't you have a full-time doctor? And they said, oh, well, because they had full-time everything else. They had a full-time physio and a masseur and manager and everything like that. And so I thought, well, why haven't you got a full-time doctor? And they said, oh, would you do it? And I said, well, yeah, I might, So anyway, I finished up doing that full-time for 5 years, and had an amazing time, 51 tests in a row, and all the ups and downs of touring. Did 2 Ashes tours, toured, West Indies, India, Sri Lanka, everywhere. It was a great experience with a great group of people. Finished up there in 2017, and haven't done a lot of sports since then. I did a year with the Melbourne Football Club in the AFL. Back, turn the clock. 40 years later, I came back to the original team I was with, and we actually won a premiership a couple of years ago, which was pretty exciting. And I decided that was a good note to go out on. And so these days, my only involvement in sport is with my amateur football team, the same Melbourne University Blues football team I've been involved with for 50 years. And I still go down there every training night and every game, and help out and do all sorts of jobs around the club. I really love that level of sport and so on. But so that's my sort of sports medicine career, I guess. And then my nutrition career has really been the last 10 years or so. I really had no particular interest in nutrition up till 10 years ago, and then was metabolically unhealthy, and discovered low carb, and turned all my health around in a very short period of time. And since then I've become a big advocate of the low carb lifestyle. I think I'll shut up now because I'm talking too much.
Oh, not at all, Peter. I thought you were cricket, and then you go through Olympics and Commonwealth Games and World University Games and Australian swim team and athletics team and AFL, and I can't believe what you've done. I had no idea. I guess what I know about you is just cricket, but you were heavily involved in it. So I just want to say, number one, congratulations. That is the most amazing CV I've ever heard in sports. So, congratulations. And it's so exciting to just still see you from the 80s to now, still in the sports arena. And obviously it is your love. And I always find when you find a love, you never get tired of it. You've just become more and more passionate about it. So let's now turn to, but before I turn to the nutrition career, I have to tell you this. So as Kim was saying to you about the 80s, so I was in Melbourne in the 80s also, and Karen Ing worked in the same building as I did. I was at Recreation in Armidale, and I met her on several occasions because she was the U-Butte sports dietitian at the time. So I was very thrilled to meet her, considering I was just a young nutritionist that had just finished my degree and was coming out. And so I watched her, but I have not seen, whether because I moved away from Melbourne, I haven't seen her much in the news. Is she still practicing?
Not practicing, I don't think. No, she does a little bit of media stuff, but certainly she's taken a sort of backward step on the media. She was very prominent in the media and publicly until probably 10 years ago or so, and does a little bit now. But no, she's got more involved in running, doing up pubs and running pub restaurants and things like that. But she was a real sort of pioneer in the world of sports. She and Louise Burke were really the two pioneers of sports nutrition in Australia, and I was very lucky because I'd known Karen since she was a young girl. She was my sister's best friend at school, and so I'd known her probably since she was about 10 years old, I think. So it was lovely to be able to work with her in those days. And we actually published a book, Food for Sport, in the 1980s, which was like the first sort of Australian sports nutrition book and so on. So it was great working with Karen. She's a wonderful person. Yeah.
Well, I do remember that book. I remember it well, but I had no idea you were the co-author. Isn't that funny? I just saw her name. My eyes were only for Karen. Sorry, not for you, Peter.
No, absolutely. I was the poor relation of that one, that's for sure.
Yeah, but now they're more for you, and the incredible changes that you have made within sports and nutrition. So let's talk about how you were awakened and then what you did for the Australian cricket team, wasn't it? At the time, you were with the Australian cricket team when this was all happening?
Yeah, it was actually just before I started with the Australian cricket team. So I was in Liverpool, and if you'd asked me then, how was I? Was I healthy? I'd have said, yeah, I'm fine. The reality was I wasn't quite as healthy as I thought I was. For a start, I had a family history of type 2 diabetes. So my father had developed type 2 diabetes at 60, exactly the age that I was then. So I was pretty aware I didn't want to go down that track. I was significantly overweight, sort of obese. I'd put on probably, half a kilogram a year for 30 years, like, many middle-aged men, and I consider 60 middle-aged. I used to think it was old, but now I think it's middle-aged. My BMI was 30, and I was obese. And I had some metabolic issues. I'd had a fatty liver for 10 years, probably at least. Every time a blood test, I'd had a blood test every couple of years. It'd come back saying, consistent with fatty liver, and I'd ignored it. I didn't really understand much about fatty liver, and I figured I was on a low-fat diet, I'd be fine. So a typical doctor, ignored what was going on. And I had high triglycerides, I had high insulin levels, and in retrospect, I was clearly pre-diabetic, but I had no idea at the time. And so I was just, blissfully eating my low-fat diet and exercising and wondering why I was getting fatter and sicker. And then an old friend of mine by the name of Tim Noakes, who you're probably aware of, South African sports scientist. So Tim and I were old mates. We'd been in the same area of sports medicine, sports science for a long time, and we often used to be invited to speak at the same conferences. And while they were talking about all their weird American sports, Tim and I find a corner and talk about cricket and rugby and the important sports. And so I was, Tim was a good friend, and Tim around about that time, came out publicly and said that he thought we had nutrition completely the wrong way around, and that it wasn't fat that was the problem, it was carbohydrate. And I remember hearing that, and I thought, "Oh, come on, Tim, really, I mean, you've been right, you've been proven correct on a few previous occasions, but this time you've really lost the plot, mate. You couldn't possibly be right. The whole of Western society has been on this low-fat diet for 40 years, and you're saying it's wrong. Come on, get serious." But because it was Tim, I thought, no, well, I really should look into this. So I read a book by Gary Taubes called Good Calories, Bad Calories. I'm sure you've read it, and many of your listeners would have read it. And this book just blew me away. I mean, I just couldn't believe what I was reading. Because not only did he talk about the sort of relative merits of fats and carbohydrates, but he talked about the politics of how the low-fat movement had won out over the low-carb movement for reasons that I'd always assumed were, science and evidence, and and turns out, like most things, to be money and politics and power and so on. So, and this book just blew me away. I mean, I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in my apartment at Liverpool, looking out over the Mersey River, and thinking, "Nah, this could not be right. Like, this couldn't be right. We couldn't all have been on the wrong diet for 40 years," and I found it really disturbing. And so being slightly OCD as I am, I dived into everything I could get my hands on, and I read every article and book. And so I spent a couple of months just diving into this. And the more I read, the more I convinced I thought, bloody Tim's right again. The bastard. I mean, he's proven everyone wrong. And so I thought, no, well, the next thing to do is try a little experiment on myself. And now we know as scientists that, experiments with an n equals 1 are a waste of time, but when you're the one, then they're not a waste of time. So I decided it was time for an n equals 1 experiment. Day one, got my blood test done, jumped on the scales, and then did 3 months of a pretty strict low-carb diet. So stopped eating all sugars, processed foods, starchy foods, rice, pasta, bread, cereal, potato, all those sorts of things. Went back to eating probably the way that my grandparents would have eaten, just real food, just meat, fish, eggs, all that cholesterol, dairy, all that fat, Non-starchy veg. The only fruit I had was berries. I had some nuts and seeds, occasional glass of red wine, and a little slither of dark chocolate every night. They were my sort of treats. And I did that for 3 months, and the results were just dramatic. I mean, I stopped initially. I stopped being hungry. Then you started to feel more energetic. Then the weight starts falling off. And anyway, to cut a long story short, after 3 months, I'd lost 13 kilograms in 13 weeks. I had reversed every one of my metabolic abnormalities. So my fatty liver that I'd had for 10 years reverted to normal. My triglycerides came down to normal. My insulin came down to normal. I felt, my exercise capacity increased. My sleep improved. I mean, so many things, felt better. There was one drawback, though. I had to get a new wardrobe because I couldn't fit into any of my clothes. But, that I think it was a small price to pay for that. So that was really a life-changing experience for me. And I guess when that sort of thing happens, you've got one of two choices. You can either sort of say, I'm all right, mate, and, just get on with things, or you can say, no, I need to tell people about this. And to be fair, I didn't really have a choice because people would come up to you and say, my God, what have you done? Have you got cancer or something? You've lost so much weight. And I said, no, I've just done this diet. And people would be questioning me and so on. So I, since then I've become a passionate advocate of this way of life, and been bashing my head against a brick wall for the last 10 years, trying to convince my profession and others that this is the way to go. And along the way, started up a charity called Sugar by Half, and published a couple of books, one called A Fat Lot of Good, and more recently the Diabetes Plan. And then a couple of years ago, we decided to tackle the issue of type 2 diabetes in this country, which is, I think, the biggest single health problem in Australia. And we started a program called Defeat Diabetes, which was an app-based program, now an app and a web-based program, basically taking people through what they need to do to combat to type 2 diabetes, to reverse their diabetes with the low-carb dietary approach. And so that's really become my sort of main passion, I guess, over the last 10 years. I spend a lot of time. I give a lot of talks. I do a lot of writing, a lot of talking to people about currently sort of there's a parliamentary inquiry into diabetes, so I'm busy sort of preparing submissions and talking to people on the inquiry and things like that. So, yeah, it's become all-consuming. But so that's my sort of, I guess my nutrition journey. As far as the cricket team goes, well, I guess, it was a bit tricky because I got involved with cricket and they already had a dietitian, and she didn't really believe in the low-carb lifestyle. And so I had to be very careful about how in fact, I resolved that I wasn't going to push the low-carb stuff at all because, this wasn't my role. I didn't want to step on her toes and create issues and so on. I thought, no, I'll just shut up. But, the problem was that, some of the boys had seen me before and after my weight loss, and they would come up and say, gosh, what have you done? That's amazing. You look amazing, and blah blah blah, and so on. And there were a few of them in particular who got very interested. The first one was probably Shane Watson, who had battled with his weight the whole of his career. Shane has a massive appetite. He eats more food than anyone I've ever come across. You go to a restaurant, he orders 2 main courses, two entrees, 2 main courses, 2 desserts, and polishes them all off. He's a very hungry boy. But as I said, he'd battled with his weight the whole career, and he found that the only way he could, keep his weight under control was to virtually starve himself, and he'd be miserable doing that. And so he was in this really bad cycle of starving himself, losing some weight, being miserable, and then eating again, and so on. And that had impacted on his career, I think. He'd as a result, he'd struggle with weight and a lot of injuries and so on. And so he was very interested in this whole concept, and he embraced it fully, and really got into the low carb. And I remember him saying to me, "Oh, this is just so fantastic! I can eat as much as I like, and I still lose weight." So he wasn't as hungry, but he still was able to eat a lot more than he had been eating, and not put on weight. So he was probably the first to really embrace it. Then Davey Warner at the time was you might remember him as quite a pudgy sort of guy when he first came on the scene. You wouldn't have called him an athlete. he was overweight and didn't have a great lifestyle and ate a lot of junk food and things. So he got a lot more interested in diet, and then he met Candice, his now wife, who was an Ironman triathlete, and so between her and myself, we got Dave interested in diet and exercise, and he transformed completely from being a relatively poor fitness level to being super fit, great fieldsman, great runner between the wickets, and he's obviously had a fantastic career. So they were a couple of the major sort of people who got into it. The other one is my favourite story is Usman Khawaja, and Usman had it's a really interesting story. He'd had a lot of knee trouble, and really bad knee trouble, and to the point where he'd had to stop playing. And he'd seen everyone. He'd been to see all sorts of specialists and so on, and had scans and had arthroscopies and so on, and no one could work out what was wrong with his knee. And he eventually had to stop playing. And eventually he saw a rheumatologist who diagnosed him with a condition called seronegative arthritis, which is similar to rheumatoid arthritis, but not actually rheumatoid. But and put him on some pretty heavy drugs, and that sort of helped a little bit, and then put him on a newish autoimmune type drug, very expensive drug that he had to inject every fortnight. And so when I met him on tour in India in 2013, he was injecting himself with this drug once a fortnight, and it was keeping his knee sort of pain under control. He said, after about 10 days after the injection, his knee would start to ache, and then he'd know it was time for his next injection. So he was back in the Australian squad. He wasn't in the team. He wasn't training fully. The coaches thought he was lazy, and he was struggling a bit with that. Anyway, he came up to me during that tour and said, "Doc, what weight you've lost? Look, I'd like to try what I feel as though I'm now 2 or 3 kilograms overweight, which he was, and I'd like to lose some of that weight. Can I follow what you did?" And I said, "Sure." So he went on to a low carb diet, and which is not, India is not the easiest place to go low carb. No rice, no naan, all that sort of stuff, but Usman's very, very disciplined. So he went on to a low-carb diet. And so 3 weeks later, he came up to me and said, "Doc, I forgot to have my injection last week." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I didn't get any knee pain, and I've sort of forgotten to take it. It's now 3 weeks. Should I take it now?" And, of course, I pretended that that's exactly what I expected, having no idea. And I said, "Oh, no, why don't you just wait and see?" Anyway, to cut a long story short, he was able to stop that medication, which was costing the taxpayer about $10,000 a year, I think. And his knee, he had no more knee pain, and he was able to increase his training. And 12 months later, he was he was back in the team and in the top 10 batsmen of the world. And now, 10 years later, he's still in the top 10 batsmen of the world, and still on a low carb diet, and still got his knee pain well and truly under control. And I guess that was a real eye-opener for me. So I really had those two light bulb moments. One, my own, health transformation. And then secondly, Usman's, because I began to understand the role that diet plays in inflammation. Mm. And inflammation is now thought to be, at the core of a lot of chronic disease. This sort of chronic low-grade inflammation is thought to be a significant cause of heart disease, of Alzheimer's, of depression, of all sorts of things. And here was someone who'd basically resolved their long-standing inflammation by changing their diet. And I thought, wow, that just blew me away. And so I started to understand that diet was so important in inflammation, and therefore could have an impact on so many different conditions. So, yeah, in a way, that taught me a lesson. As I said, I pretended that's what I expected to happen with Usman, but of course I had no idea. And it was as much of a shock to me as it was to Us. And we've chatted about it often since then. And he's loving that lifestyle, and it's made a big difference to him, and it's made a big difference to me, and that it's opened my eyes to the importance of inflammation and the effect that diet can have on inflammation. And I've looked into that a lot now, and read a lot on that, and And it seems that it's sort of, processed foods and particularly sugars and seed oils that are really the things that cause inflammation. And if you can avoid those processed foods, which all contain those sugar and seed oils and grains, so, you can really have an impact on those sort of inflammatory conditions. So, I'm now involved in some research into that. And, I've had a number of other people with similar issues, arthritis and so on, significantly improve their symptoms by changing their diet.
I hope every athlete hears this, Peter, because a lot of athletes believe that they can eat whatever they want because they run. And what you have said, about he obviously either had an injury or just that inflammation was there or based on an injury. And it was basically, fixed by eating the right foods. So I hope every athlete hears this because I don't think athletes know this. And I don't think that most of the people know this. The amount of friends I have, so I'm in my 60s, and the amount of friends that I have now going,
surely not.
Surely, yes. but the amount of my friends that are going in for hip replacements or knee replacements, I'm absolutely blown away by it. And I keep wanting to say, have you looked at the food that you're consuming? Did you realize food has a lot to do with, these issues and what's happening? I'm not saying so much like a really bad injury. I'm talking about all of a sudden your hip hurts and then you start limping and then the inflammation continues and obviously the joint degrades and so on and so on. So we'll be pushing this to the sports people so that they can listen to this. I want to ask you, you're obviously doing a lot on a political policy level, which I think is tough work. I'd rather work on a ground, like a bit of a groundswell of an effect rather than a grassroots level than the policy level. But my question is, why is the government, number one, and perhaps even medicine, not getting this, not realising that if we improved our diets, we'd improve our chronic disease rate. It would be far less. Our metabolic syndrome problems would be less. Diabetes would be less. It would be less of a problem on the medical system or the Medicare system or the public system, less on our hospitals. And we knew through COVID, if you had a metabolic disease or you had chronic conditions, then the likelihood of dying of, COVID was far greater than if you were a healthy specimen. So being on that policy level, I want to ask you, what don't they get?
Very good questions. Very good. I have the same questions. It's funny, isn't it? Once you discover something like this, and it just seems so bloody obvious, what's got to be done, and you sort of struggle with the fact, well, why can't everyone see that? If it's so obvious to us, why isn't it so obvious to everyone else? And I don't think there's any one particular reason, but I think there's a whole bunch of reasons. The first, if we tackle the medical profession or the health industry, health professions in general, we're very, doctors in particular, are very conservative, very traditional. They believe everything they were taught in medical school. They're very reluctant to change anything. And they're very focused on what they know. And what doctors know is drugs and surgery. And what they don't know is nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress. And so they stay in their comfort zone. So the doctor is not going to give you dietary advice because they don't know anything about nutrition. I didn't have a single lecture on nutrition in my 6 years of medicine, not one. I don't think things have changed much since then. So the first premise is that doctors know nothing about nutrition, which most patients assume that doctors know about nutrition. They know nothing. They just say, "Oh, go and follow the dietary guidelines," which that's another issue. They're wrong. But so that's an issue. So they stay in their comfort zone, and basically their comfort zone is drugs, is medications. So you go and see a doctor. You've got 10 minutes with your GP. By the time he's sort of assessed you and so on, there's about a minute or two left to make some recommendation. So the easiest thing for him to do is to write a prescription for a drug. He hasn't got time to spend 20 minutes talking to you about diet and lifestyle and stress and exercise and, set you an exercise program and go through your diet and all that sort of stuff. He's just got time to write you a script, and people expect a script from their doctor. That's why they go to the doctor. They sort of complain if they don't get one. And so I think, the medical profession needs to, really have a serious look at themselves. And part of the problem is that, the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma, is incredibly influential in medical education. Most doctors get, most of their information on medicine from their drug reps. It brings around the latest, supposed research and drugs and so on. Or they go to a drug-sponsored, dinner or conference or something like that, where it's all just about medications, and there's no one there talking about diet and exercise and so on. So they stay in their comfort zone. So that's a significant problem. The other issue, obviously, is in the broader population, and that's where, as influential as the pharmaceutical industry is in medicine, the food industry is so influential in the broader population, and they're incredibly clever, and they're incredibly rich, and they can spend a lot of money, firstly developing foods that are cheap, that are tasty, that look good, they feel good, and then they market the hell out of them very cleverly, So let's take breakfast cereals, or cereal flavored sugars, as I call them. They'll promote, they're all wonderful, coloured boxes that says, low this, low that, low fat, low whatever, high fibre. But basically it's just full of sugar. And kids love it, because kids get addicted. They find sugar attractive and so on. And so, the kids are walking along the supermarket aisles with mum and say, "Mummy, I want that, And so you start the day with cereal, with basically a cup of sugar, and it just goes from there. So, the food industry is very clever the way they present food and market food and develop food, and they've got us all addicted to sweetness. We expect things to be sweet now because of so much sugar around, and they can produce these processed foods, or actually you shouldn't really call them foods. They're things that are made to look like food, so cheaply, and tasty. So, of course, people will, and they're easy to make. I mean, you're both parents are working, you're busy, you pick up the kids from childcare, get home at 6 o'clock, you've got to feed them, do their homework, bathe them, all that sort of stuff in the next hour. And what's the easiest thing to do? Spend an hour cooking a proper meal or heat up the frozen pizza, and which the kids, love anyway. So it's a really difficult situation, and it needs a very courageous government, I think, to tackle those issues. Even simple things like sugar tax, we couldn't even get that over the line here, and many other countries have. And, restrictions on junk food advertising on TV at kids' times, and you can't get that across the line. So it's really difficult. I mean, the food industry is very powerful. They have a lot of influence over government, and it's very hard to beat that. We don't have lobbyists. We don't have money to donate to political parties. We just have science. Well, doesn't seem to work anymore, does it? So it's really frustrating, and I quite accept. You say, look, it's probably a waste of time, all this political stuff. And I've always said the same. I always said this has got to be a grassroots movement. It's got to come from below. Patients have got to educate their doctors. Patients have got to educate their MPs, and so on. But there is a little bit of interest at the moment, and hence this parliamentary inquiry into diabetes that is currently underway, and I would encourage everyone to make a submission. There's no restriction on who can make a submission. Get online, make a submission. It's very easy to do, and just tell them your story. If you've got a good story, tell them your story. The more people who tell them their stories, the more they're going to listen. And if you've got a good low-carb story, you've improved your health metabolically and lost weight and so on, particularly if you've reversed your diabetes, as we know we can do now with diet, tell them. tell this parliamentary inquiry that that's what you've done, and the more people who do that, the better, and that'd be very valuable. So, look, it's too good an opportunity to miss. I agree. I don't particularly like doing all this sort of politicking and so on, but I've made appointments to meet most of the people on the committee. I'm going up to Sydney next week to meet a couple of them. I've already had a meeting with one of the committee members in Melbourne. So there are 4 doctors in the House of Reps, and 3 of them are on the 8-person committee. Another one's an observer to the committee, and so on. So I'm meeting with all of them over the next couple of weeks, and I had a very positive response from Michelle Anandaraja, who's the new member for Higgins in Victoria, who happens to be my local member, and I had a great meeting with her, and she was very positive and so on. So, you've got to try, and I'm certain. This seems like such a good opportunity to get diet on the agenda of diabetes, because it's not even on the agenda. I mean, the Diabetes Australia just put out a strategic plan, which is 30 pages, and mentioned the word diet once, and didn't actually talk about the role of diet in the management of diabetes. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, that they don't even understand that, and we're trying to educate them a little bit, and I've actually been invited to speak at the Australian Diabetes Congress in a couple of weeks' time, where all the diabetes heavies are going to be there, and I'm not sure anyone will turn up to listen, but I'll certainly give it a go, and just see if we can and just try and get diet on the agenda for diabetes, because it's so clear now, as far as diabetes is concerned, is that diet is the key to success. I mean, we were always told when I was in medical school that type 2 diabetes is a chronic progressive disease, that you're on medication for life, there's no hope, But it's been shown both here and overseas that there is hope. You can actually put diabetes into remission, by a low-carb diet, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, what is type 2 diabetes? It's a disease of carbohydrate intolerance. So, as my kids would say, duh, you don't eat carbohydrates. I mean, it's not that, it's not that difficult. And yet, the recommended diet for diabetes has been a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, because of this obsession with fat and heart disease and so on, which has all been disproven anyway. So, it's incredibly frustrating. And sometimes, I agree. I feel as though I'm bashing my head against a brick wall. And other times, then you get an email from someone saying, I've read your book and it's changed my life. And you think, oh, okay, well, I'll keep going for another week. Here we go. So, yeah, it is challenging. But anyway, I'm a stubborn bastard and I'll keep trying.
Well, congratulations on all that you have achieved. And thank goodness we have you in our corner. And there's more and more doctors that are coming into that corner. Like, we have Dr. James Mukey, we have Gary Fedke. I just went to a talk, and I was talking about this to you before we even started recording. And I just went to a talk in Albury Wodonga, and there were 3 medical doctors in the room. One was talking on blue light and sunshine and things like that, and getting outside and grounding. He was talking about that. The other one was talking on visceral fat. And what do you call them? A toffee, thin on the outside, but fat on the inside. So he was talking about that. And the other one was talking about the influence of what you've just said, the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry in influencing diet and the medical profession. So I will make sure that submission link is on our notes, so that people can go to it, and please put a submission in, because people who are listening to us, Peter, and we've been doing Up for a Chat. We did have a hiatus of a couple of years, but we've been doing it for at least 10 years now. So we will make sure that submission goes up.
Yeah, and people sort of say, oh, they're not interested in hearing from me. Yes, they are interested in hearing from everyone. And I think the more, non-medical, just the more patients, have experienced this, that they hear from, it can be really powerful. So, I can get up there and give all the science and all that sort of stuff, but if, it's the personal stories that are so powerful. And if you've got a personal story, then tell them, because, as I said, very, very powerful, very influential.
It's interesting. I was watching something this morning, and it was talking about education in children with autism, and there was 115 submissions for these kids needing to be in education. Now, this is in the US, this wasn't Australia. And they had a committee, and then everyone had 2 minutes to tell their story. And the committee were rude. They were on their phones, they were talking, and I didn't see that they cared about these parents. And I just that's what frustrates me, is I wonder, we're going to do these submissions, and I don't think that there's any harm in doing it, at least give it a try. But sometimes I wonder, are they listening but not listening? And will they take these submissions into heart, considering that the lobbyists, which are for big pharma and big food and big agriculture, those types of things, have got a far more weight and money than we'll ever have. So in a way, it frustrates me. So that was the one thing I wanted to let you know about. And the second thing is that there's an American presidential candidate who says the one thing he's going to do when he gets into office is to tackle the chronic health issues that they're now seeing in the US. I think that's the first time I've ever seen that as a platform for anyone in it. I was just blown away by what he said, and I went, where's our Australian one?
Unfortunately, he's not going to get elected, but it would be great if he did. But I think going back to the point about the inquiry and so on.
Yes.
I think I've always sort of said that the day that politicians realise there's votes in improving people's diet and nutrition will be the day when we win. And, because let's face it, the majority of politicians are just interested in getting elected, and they'll do whatever is necessary to make their electorate happy. And if there's enough of us out there saying to them, we want something done about nutrition in this country to tackle the problems of chronic disease, then they might listen. So numbers are important, getting as much noise and as much as we can there. I think that, that can help. So, as I said, I encourage everyone to do that.
All right. And would you say call our local MP and ask them to think about this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think,
okay.
if you can get an audience with you, most MPs will see someone in their electorate if they're asked. You might have to persevere a couple of times, but and if you can bring this subject up and say, look, there's this diabetes inquiry. They may not be on the committee, but they will know people on the committee. There are members of parliament from all the parties on this, so it's not just a government one. It's a broad-based one, and as I said, there are 4 doctors on it, and they all care, I think, about health and so on. So I see it as a good chance. It's not going to change the world, but I just think if we can get these things on the agenda and make people aware, then we might get somewhere. So enough said.
Wonderful.
Perhaps, Peter, your favourite word at the beginning of today was useful, and perhaps we could all have a useful approach to this where we all get involved and get behind it. After all, it's all about numbers. I'm fascinated by everything. I have told Cindy this before. I loved you back then when I was a mere 19-year-old, and you were part of the crew that also our coaches listened to. I happened to run for Australia in the World Ultramarathon Indoor 24-Hour Championships in London with Cliff Young and Brian Smith and those kind of guys, John Bright. So I just want you to know how much you had a big impact on me back then. So did Karen. And yes, we did carb load, and yes, it was all the right science at the time, we thought. Yep. But one thing I want to say, if you as a doctor with as much medical knowledge and perhaps even a questioning or curious mind, which is what hopefully university and tertiary education gives us, you didn't even want to pick up on the signs or signals that diet was related, let alone diabetes. So how does the mere mortal really get on board when you say so many people are advocating the old way of being? Because being married to a cricketer, my husband is a sports commentator. Maybe you could talk to him and sit next to him in the next IPL. But Danny, back when he played in the day, debuted against Australia in the Benson and Hedges series, the Rothman series, sponsored by DB Breweries and all sorts of things. It's a very big challenge. The one thing that changed Danny way after his career was reading a book by Novak Djokovic, Serve to Win, which was all about dropping carbs. Remember?
I read that book. Yeah.
And
I've actually got a good Novak Djokovic story. I'll tell you in a minute. Yeah, go on.
Oh, good, please do. Well, that I could have told him everything that I was learning from Cindy, from what I was learning from amazing advocates in all of your space. But the one thing that turned him was reading Novak's book, which was a real athlete. So from your perspective, perhaps at a grassroots level, perhaps from a sporting perspective, where so many of us watch it, live on it, bet on it, are curious about it, go to it, maybe sporting, the sporting realm is where we could really make an impact. But I'm just curious to you how you're making an impact into the sporting profession when, with respect, dietitians and other doctors still don't have this philosophy.
Yeah, look, I think things are changing slowly in the sporting world, and the same as they are in the rest of the world. In that, I think we're not quite as obsessed with carbs as we used to be. The old sort of, pasta party the night before the marathon and carbs, and so on. There's a growing awareness that fat is also a very good fuel for exercise, particularly for endurance athletes. And we're now seeing people doing Ironman triathlons, on no food, just fat adapted and using their fat stores to fuel them and so on. So that's a pretty radical change. And certainly there's this sort of philosophy now of train low, compete high, and that more and more sort of footballers and cricketers and others are basically going low carb, sort of most of the time, and then on game day or the night before they'll load up on some carbs, not massive amounts, but load up on some carbs, and they're hoping to get the best of both worlds, if you like. Because there's lots of advantages to not having lots of carbs. Because of that inflammation we talked about before, and better recovery, and not having to eat the whole time and drink the whole time, and so on. So there's distinct advantages to using fat as a fuel, and there's a lot of interest in this whole area, and I think more and more people are moving away from the obsession with carbs. The dietitians are a little bit slow to adapt, I have to say, but we'll get there eventually. People are very reluctant. I mean, if you've been pushing something for 30 years, it's very hard to suddenly sort of, do a 180-degree turn and say, actually, well, everything I've been saying for 30 years is wrong. You got to do this now. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. I certainly found it quite challenging, I must admit. But
Peter, can I just interrupt you there? I think the key to that, though, is what you said before, is the stories. They may not want to hear that change, but the minute someone saw you had lost 13 kilos, the curiosity of what did you do? How did you do it? So people telling their story is perhaps one of the best ways. Fill their hearts before their heads is what I was always taught. If you can connect into someone's reason why, or give them an absolute true story of recovery or transformation, that surely would have some impact. And don't forget to tell us Novak's story.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think stories are so powerful. And as I said, I can write all the science and, give them references and all that sort of stuff, but it's not as powerful as someone's individual story. And, that's why I think, there's an opportunity here for people to tell their stories and really have an impact. And people love stories, people love to hear stories, So I'll tell you my Novak story. And I was... I got a phone call one night. I think it was 2008, and it was literally the night before the Australian Open started. And at that stage, Novak Djokovic had never won a Grand Slam. He had a reputation as being a bit soft. He would pull out of a lot of games, and he wasn't really considered a serious contender. Anyway, his management rang me and said, "Look, we've been given your name. We'd love you to be part of Team Novak, and we're here in Melbourne, and." We'd like you to come, like to use you as our doctor for the next 2 weeks, and come be part of the team and sit in the box, and spend the next 2 weeks with us and so on. And I'd literally just arrived down the coast for our first family holiday in about 5 years, and I thought, oh my God, I can't not not go on with this holiday, so I'll be divorced. So I had to toss it up, divorce versus Novak. It was a tough one. I had to think about it. But no, I said to his manager, look, I'd love to, but I really can't. And he was quite put on. He was quite put off. He said, well, "What do you mean you can't? This is Novak Djokovic." I said, "Look, I know. Look, I understand, but you've got to understand my situation. I've got 4 kids. We haven't had a family holiday for a couple of years. We've just arrived down here for 2 weeks holiday. I can't do it." And he said, but, he really just couldn't believe I was saying no. Anyway, so that year, what happens? You can guess what happens. He bloody wins. And so, I could have rocked on to, been with Novak Djokovic for 2 weeks, taken all the credit for him winning his first Grand Slam, and probably, had a nice cruisy life for the last 20 years. But went on a holiday with my family instead. Anyway, can't win them all.
Oh, thank God you're still married. I hope they hear this.
That's a story.
That's right. I haven't made too many bad decisions, but that was probably a bad one. Anyway, not to worry.
I don't know. It might have cost you a lot more if you'd been divorced.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Oh, Peter, do you?
Anyway.
So, do you still? What's your favourite sport now? I know we're going to come to a close, but what do you love watching these days?
Oh, look, I love watching all sport. I love watching cricket. I love watching footy, AFL, soccer. Athletics has always been a real sort of passion of mine. They're probably the 4 sports that I really love watching. But I love watching all sport. Rugby union, I enjoy that. Even league, hockey. My kids played hockey. I got quite involved in hockey. I did a bit of time with the Australian hockey team. I didn't mention that before, but and then ran our local hockey club for a few years and so on. So yeah, I love hockey.
Can't believe the All Blacks haven't run you, Peter.
Yeah, I love sport. And. It's a great hobby, and I've been very lucky. I've been able to combine my hobby and my passion with my career, and so lucky to be able to do that. Not many people could do that, and I've just been really lucky to be in the right time at the right place. If I was 20 years older, sports medicine wouldn't have existed in this country. 20 years younger, there's lots of people wanting to do it and so on. So there'd have been a lot more competition. So I was very lucky in the timing and so on. Just really fortunate. I sort of there hasn't been a day when I haven't got out of bed in the morning and not look forward to go to work. And if you can say that, at the end of your career, then you're pretty lucky, really. So I've been blessed. Worked with I had 4 great passions in sport. As I said, those 4 sports. AFL, soccer, cricket, and athletics. And I worked at the top level in every one of them. World Cups and Olympics and all that. So, grand finals. I've been really, really fortunate. But I wish I'd, been able to walk through the long room at Lord's with my spikes on and going to open the batting for Australia. But, second best thing was, being there as the club doctor, plan B.
Mm. It sounds like you have unbelievable gratitude for everything that you've achieved in your life. And I have unbelievable gratitude for the times that you've said yes to me. And I'd like our audience to know that you have said yes to me for our Melbourne conference that we're having March 9th, 2024. So I just want to say I'm really excited about hearing you speak, because every time I hear you, you have something new to say. So no doubt March 9th, I'm going to learn so much more. So I'm looking forward to that.
All right, I'll come up with some news stories for you.
Thank you.
Peter, we just want to say thank you on behalf of the two of us and every single person listening to this. I'm still blown away that I have your book. I have Karen's Food for Sport book. It was my go-to back then, that you were part of my sporting career in a very small but very significant way. And I just want to say thank you for that. I did set a world record as the youngest female to run 100 miles. So I feel like you may have had a little part to play in that, even though I'm not really in anybody, really, considering all these other amazing sports people. But thank you. And thank you also for talking not only about your passion and your philosophy, like even this family first is a massive philosophy which shows us the depth of who you are, all jokes aside, and also your desire to support sport at a grassroots level. That really is the foundation of all sport, of all amazing athletes that we get to see and witness at a top level. And I think Cindy and I would just really love to say thank you for being you.
Oh, well, thank you guys too. You're doing a great job in promoting this this whole lifestyle and this whole movement, and it's a really important role you play. So keep up the good work, and happy to come on anytime. So look forward to that conference next March, and very happy to chat anytime. Thank you for having me.
If we ever hear that you're away on a holiday though with your family, we will think that we're priority though.
Okay, absolutely.
or we may just turn up.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Yeah.
Oh,
maybe the Paris Olympics or something like that. That'd be a good one. Please, yeah.
Hey, I'm sure Danny would still bowl to you at this point if you want to have a little crack. I'm sure he could crank that arm over and let you open some sort of batting situation.
I'd like I need a decent bowler to bowl to me. Not a Kiwi. Not a Kiwi. Come on.
Oh my gosh, he just walked in the room. If he heard you, then he may have thrown up that water.
All right. Well, say hello to him for us, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Time for a quick break on Up for a Chat to share our favourite products.
Dr. Peter Bruckner is an incredible speaker. He's also got some wonderful accolades under his belt, and he will be part of our Nutrition Summit that we will be holding in Melbourne on March 9th. For more information, just go to www.thenutrition.academy to look for tickets and other speakers.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/TheWellnessCouch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives.
Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.